It is not the intention necessarily that the focus of this be about hell. But how would you characterize our present reality? For a small minority, of course, it is not a hell. But even the most fortunate must be feeling a bit anxious about things. The trouble is, we don't always admit it. It's not really a popular topic of conversation, now is it? In fact, if you bring up the topic with another person or group, you are likely to get the response, "Can we talk about something else?" Or, "Can we talk about something more positive?" Changing the subject does nothing to alter reality. Rather, it is an avoidance tactic. Our civilization, still in the early 21st century, seems highly adept at avoiding reality. There exists such an enormous plethora of things to engage in and be entertained by and distracted with that we seem to not be able to take anything seriously. As we exist, we seem to collectively and individually embody the depiction of crazed Roman Emperor Nero, who was said to fiddle while Rome burned. Let us all be permanently and maniacally happy. This is like an unspoken mantra of our civilization. The morose and brooding person of thought is told to stop being so glum and try putting on a smile. Now, there is nothing wrong with being happy. It is a preferred way of being, provided your reality is largely untroubled. But a mandated happiness seems highly maladaptive when there is a darkening wall of a tsunami growing on the horizon, and you refuse to get off the paradisial wonderland of the beach. Happiness, as it is unofficially mandated, is such a surface-level emotion. When you really know people, and often these days we do not, because although we may have a great many virtual friends that we have collected, how many actual friends do we have? If we are fortunate, however, to have some actual real-life good friendships, then we may know people at depth, beyond the protective surface of happiness. And real friendship is messy. It is anything but the tidy and contrived happiness that we wear like a mask. More often than not, we are a chaotic jumble of mixed emotions inside ourselves. That, in and of itself, is hopeful. It suggests complexity. We're not simply the sanitized happy masks that we wear in polite conversation. We are a mix of emotions, and not the least of these is fear. Fear is what bubbles to the surface when we sense that things are crumbling. We may not articulate our fear directly with our happy masks intact, but we may not even admit it to ourselves that fear is driving us. Yet we see fear's influence every day as we witness rash behavior, as we see people rallying behind extreme views. And extreme views are not just jihadist. They are found wherever there is a belief that a wall will solve a problem. If a tsunami is a small one, the wall may well protect. But the future is not just one tsunami. It is many. And some of them will be of such a monstrous scale that no wall built by human hand can withstand the force. That sounds ominous, doesn't it? And where are those tsunamis? The tsunamis are our big problems, and they are our immense ones. They tend to be societal, or at least they ought to be viewed as such, for at times a problem may emerge and it may be localized, so that we are not affected directly. But that should not give us a pass. We should not say, "It is not my problem." An illustration, pick a natural disaster, a flood, for example. Hardly a week goes by without some community being caught up in a natural disaster. And floods are fairly common, but they tend to be localized, one community or several in a given area. Our ability to feel empathy and even to extend a hand has a lot to do with our ability to identify with the victims of the disaster. If they are just down the road and we personally know some of the people, we are likely to be among the first responders. If they are more distant, but they are just like us, same culture, same skin tone, same language, etc., we may also lend a hand. But at a greater distance, with people whom we share no common identity with, our charity may be limited to pocket change, or we may have no charity at all. To the point that these localized tsunami problems are, or should be viewed as societal, we need to always remind ourselves that these big problems, whether they are disasters or some human homicidal insanity, or some emergent virus or whatever, these things ripple out. Negative ripple effects travel further than ever these days, in part because we know about things, sometimes even in real time. The empathetic human cannot help but to feel, as dramas, catastrophe, and carnage are reported with seeming ever greater frequency. But for most people, even empathy has its limits. A few tsunami-type problems, especially if they are of a smaller, localized scale, may evoke feelings of empathy, and we may step up to see what we can do. But when the tsunami waves come at us unceasingly, when there seems to be no end to the desperation and need, then we start to experience compassion fatigue, or donor fatigue as it relates to charitable giving. Have you experienced something like this? Think of shopping and the inquiry to you as a customer at the checkout. Would you like to add a couple of dollars for cause X? The first few times that happens, you may be inclined to say, sure, it's a worthy cause. But what happens when you get asked such a question for the 50th time, or the 100th? At some point you might say, no, not today. You are starting to feel overwhelmed. Your ability to feel compassion or empathy is taxed too heavily, in part because you see more and more need. Or consider online petitions. The first time you may read the whole email and conclude that's a good cause, and you sign virtually and encourage others to do so on your Facebook page. Do you behave differently when you start getting several such emails a day? Can you even read them all on top of whatever other emails you already get? The compassion fatigue phenomena is one of the things have a growing impact on our social reality in the present. It is not just that there seems to be more and more problems of natural disasters or mass senseless murder or of the exodus of desperate people seeking asylum. The situation may seem all the more hopeless because no matter how much we throw at problems, the problems just don't seem to go away. Rather, they only seem to be getting worse. And so we distract ourselves from this reality. And so we seek to build walls to keep this reality out. This response, call it shutting out, or of the fear-evoking reality, is actually something of a natural response, given that there seems to be no end in sight to the very serious problems that are out there. In part, we are somewhat conditioned to such a shutting out response because of the social insistence of the happy approach to life. Happiness as an overarching emotional state only becomes a mask when our reality does not support our having this state of mind. It is never that problems are absent in the world. They have always existed. That does not mean that we have never been entitled to our happiness. In times when problems were of a small scale, we could well condone our happiness because we knew that there were people working on the problems, and we could feel vindicated in our happiness when we contributed to the noble work of such individuals. The thrust of this argument might seem to suggest an anti-happiness view. To think that that is what is being argued is to miss the point. It is because there are kinds of happiness. The dominant form of happiness which we have pursued in Western culture has been one of material accumulation. Happiness in this setting largely derives from having the good life that comes with things like a big house, fancy cars, or 5-star vacations and the latest smartphone. Various crises, especially when they begin to become unmanageable, threaten this happiness. And so it seems like distraction when we try to shut it out with yet more distraction. This is a delusional kind of insanity that reminds us of something Einstein once said. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Do we really think that by ignoring the very real and enormous problems that they will somehow go away? We ought to listen to that inner voice that tells us there is something wrong with this whole picture. There must be more than this. A part of the answer is that we ought to seek a qualified happiness. That is more of a mature kind of happiness, rather than this childlike version that is predominant. We ought to seek a happiness that emerges from our giving our best. This would feel more like a fulfilling form of happiness. It is a feeling that comes after perseverance against extraordinary forces. The sensation that arrives after giving your all in a scenario where you have felt tested. Imagine how it must feel when you have completed an arduous pilgrimage. There is a satisfaction of depth when the journey of self-discovery is undertaken, and also when it is completed. The scars that are received along the way are like badges of honor. They indicate that a life has been lived for real. In a sense, this is one of those when the going gets tough moments in our history. It requires that people of character and grit even step up and lead. It is also a time in our history where a fresh infusion of ideas would be welcome and useful. We do not need to completely reinvent ourselves. There is much that is useful in many of our old ideas. Rather, some of our ideas may need tweaking. But we may also seek to overlay some new ideas that can alter the context of our thinking. This is similar to the way computing power is built over time. Anyone familiar with computers and software knows that the old architecture is still there. We are simply adding new lines of code to be able to do things which the oldest architecture alone could not do. This argument uses a particular kind of reasoned rhetoric because the author happens to believe in something. The belief is that there is an untapped human nature, the deep human, that is in so many individuals just itching to get out. The shallow human, that one of surface level happiness and of all of the material accoutrements of life that we gather around ourselves to preserve our happiness, that human is unequal to the task at hand. We should not try to sugarcoat it. That is what we reflexively do when we live in service to the unwritten laws of the happy mandate. Let us look directly into the abyss at one of the biggest tsunami forces. It may require that we summon some courage that is inherently a part of our deep natures. Take, for example, a very large tsunami force that is gathering and is already flooding among us, welling up our fears and shocking us out of our happiness bubbles. This force is the exodus of all kinds of desperate peoples out of what is a true hell on earth and into sanctuary wherever they can get it. The numbers are staggering. By the end of 2015, there were 65.3 million people displaced from their homes. In an absolute sense, this is more people living in acute desperation than there has ever been. To put that number in perspective, there are more people in dire straits than the total populations of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand combined. Thus far, 1/3 of that huge number of people have made it outside their homeland. Many are in refugee camps, hoping to get into the heart of Europe, and of course, a significant number of people have managed to get to a destination where they are attempting to start a new life. But fully 2/3 of that 65 million are still internally displaced. So they are stuck in their home country, basically homeless and in camps where such facilities even exist. So the flow of people has not stopped. In fact, given the numbers that are desperate, we can say that so far we have only seen the tip of the iceberg. As mentioned, this is the greatest number of people in desperation and on the move that has ever been, from the perspective of known history. This number now exceeds the numbers of totally displaced peoples that were around during and following World War II. Estimates of that time vary widely because it was difficult to have accurate records amidst the chaos. But even more extreme estimates put that number at less than 60 million in 1945. One advantage we have over 1945 is that we do not also have to rebuild Europe this time on top of dealing with so much desperation. But a disadvantage is that no one that made decisions back then is likely to be alive now to help us with that, with some kind of informed precedent. If you do the math, it's easy to see that 70 years ago, and as we know, most people that make decisions are at least 30 years or older. No matter how you slice it, we are still, and we will be dealing with, this tsunami force for the foreseeable future. And what if the situation does not improve, but actually worsens? So this, in a nutshell, is why the point is made that shallow happiness and the material pursuits thereof, and the type of person that emerges out of this social reality, is inadequate to the task at hand. We are at a tipping point or crunch time that is unique in all of human history. Massive change will come out of this, and it will be exceedingly dangerous to try to fight it. 65 plus million people, desperate and on the move, cannot be contained by any wall for very long. So we might as well face reality and stop trying to hide from it. Only in facing change and being realistic can we hope to affect that change. We need to be engaged if we are to avoid something that will resemble scriptural apocalypse. There is a silver lining here. This argument would not be made if it all seemed completely hopeless. Perhaps we have needed things to come to this, to snap us out of our complacency. In a real sense, as was mentioned in episode 1, a great many, if not most of us, have felt at one time or another that there must be more to life than this. That splinter in the mind. It is challenge that cannot be avoided that builds character, that awakens us. As mentioned, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. It is believed by yours truly that we are, all of us, tougher than we think. As this argument continues, that case will be made. The motivation is manifold. The compulsion comes from having had a taste. The true human being is tougher, sweeter, and more full than we can currently imagine. Awakened to itself, the true human is the embodiment of beauty itself. It is time for us to shine and be known to ourselves. We cannot afford to wait any longer. Heady stuff, that episode 2. I'm almost predisposed to apologize. I take no pleasure in taking you to that abyss, but ignorance can never be bliss for too long. In ignoring a thing, we allow it to fester and grow. It is this way for society. It is this way for an individual. For a long time, I kept things to myself, for the most part, except for a few good friends that allowed me to burden them. I hope with an equal reciprocation for hearing them, too. Those few critical friends allowed me to feel validation when I was predisposed to self-doubt. I shudder to think where I might be, if not for those friendships. And so, I am deeply appreciative for having been carried for a time. This says something critical about humanity. We all need one another. We cannot go it alone. There is a great deal of hope in that we are built this way. For whenever we combine our efforts, whenever we are supported by a compassionate community, we are able to do some truly amazing things. That kind of social engagement is a precondition for us to achieve a greater measure of self-realization. It has been so for me. In a very real sense, a big part of my being able to think as I do and to develop ideas over the years has been dependent on the relationships of depth that allowed me to see myself more clearly than any mirror could ever do. Those relationships were a context for me to believe that there was more to life, that we were missing, and so I went exploring ideas, looking in places that had been gathering dust. And what have I found? Well, that is what I'll be fleshing out. For now, I will say that the splinter in the mind idea, which actually came to resonate for me from the original Matrix movie by the Wachowskis, that splinter is like a beacon that has been shining out for any that would turn to see it.